The winter of 1833 came down over the Scottish Highlands like a sentence written in ice, and Elspeth Drummond knew that every step she took through the snow could be her last. The path she had walked since childhood was gone, buried beneath white. The pine trees, bent under the weight of frost, stood in silence, like mourners gathered to watch her fall. She was 22 years old. Her lungs burned with every breath. And back home, a fevered mother waited for medicine that might already be too late. 3 years. That was how long the name Drummond had stopped being spoken with respect in the drawing rooms of Edinburgh. 3 years since her father, the Viscount of Ardmore, had been found dead in his study, a pistol in his hand and a letter no one ever allowed the family to read. The title remained, but everything that once gave it meaning had been stripped away by scandal. The family that once moved among the highest circles now lived in quiet exile, in a modest house at the edge of Glencairn. They survived on allowances managed by distant relatives and on the quiet stubbornness of 3 sisters who refused to disappear. The storm worsened without warning. Snow lashed her face like small blades of ice. Her legs, already shaking with exhaustion, finally gave in as the cold sank deep into her bones. She fell to her knees, then sideways. Her body disappeared into the snow, as if the land itself were claiming her. She thought of her sisters, of Moira, 19, stitching handkerchiefs to sell in the village, and pretending she didn't cry when night came. Of Aileen, only 15, who still believed that one day someone would prove their father was not the monster the newspapers had made him. She thought of her mother, of the cough that had grown worse, of the eyes that on the worst days of fever no longer recognized her own daughters. And then she thought of nothing at all. The last thing Elspeth saw before darkness closed in was a tall shadow emerging from the storm. A man, broad-shouldered, wrapped in a dark wool cloak. He lifted her from the snow as if she weighed no more than a broken promise. She tried to speak, to thank him, to ask his name, but the cold had already sealed her voice. And the darkness took her before she could know that she had just been saved by the one man in the world who had every reason to wish for her ruin. I love imagining which oceans our stories are traveling across right now. So if you'd like, tell me in the comments the city or the country where you're listening from. Every message lets me travel a little farther around the world. And if you'd like to follow our next stories, please like the video and subscribe to the channel. It would be a joy to have you in our community. Now, let's continue. Introduction. Elspeth Drummond should not have been in that forest. She knew it when she closed the door before dawn. She knew it when she ignored Moira's hand on her wrist and Aileen's whispered plea, "Wait for the wind to calm." And she knew it again when the frozen air seemed to bite from the inside, as if the cold could reach what was still alive and persuade it to give up. But her mother's cough had worsened during the night. It wasn't just the sound. It was the pauses between the fits, the way her breathing grew shallow, the fevered light in eyes that no longer recognized their own home. The nearest apothecary was 2 hours away on foot. In summer, 2 hours were just 2 hours. In a Highland winter, 2 hours could be a sentence. There had been a time when the Drummonds did not walk for medicine. There had been carriages, servants, doctors who came to the door, and a house in Edinburgh where the windows shone like promises. That time ended with a gunshot no one heard, with a letter that never reached the family's hands, and with headlines that turned her father's name into a synonym for disgrace. Viscount of Ardmore, the man who fled his debts. Viscount of Ardmore, the noble who abandoned his family. Viscount of Ardmore, the name now spoken only in whispers. Elspeth never believed the whole story, but truth, she learned early, was a luxury ruined families could not afford. At 22, survival was all that remained. Survival for herself, for Moira, for Aileen, and for her mother. That thought pushed her out the door. That thought carried her forward when her fingers lost all feeling. And that same thought began to fail, not as courage but as flesh, when the wind shifted without warning, and the forest she had known all her life became something else. A place that did not care about names, or titles, or promises. A place capable of swallowing a girl whole and erasing every trace she had ever existed. Chapter 1. The White Forest. Cold had a sound. It wasn't the howl of the wind. It was something lower, more intimate. A quiet hum beneath the skin, vibrating in the bones, with the persistence of a question that refused to be answered. Elspeth realized this when the path began to disappear beneath the snow, when the world lost color and direction, when even her thoughts started to feel too heavy to carry. She should have waited. Moira had said so. Aileen had begged. Her mother hadn't had the strength to ask at all. She had only looked at Elspeth with fevered eyes, as if she no longer knew what century she was in. That was what sent her out. Not heroism, necessity. The kind of necessity that leaves no room for caution, only for movement. Her shawl clung to her shoulders, soaked and heavy like a burial shroud. The gloves were no longer gloves, only useless memories of warmth. And her feet inside worn boots were no longer feet at all, just numb blocks she dragged forward out of pride, stubbornness and fear. Fear of returning empty-handed. Fear of watching her mother lose the battle that very night. But the forest did not negotiate. The frost-bent pines stood like silent sentinels, severe and unmoved. Snow fell in swirling moods that shifted by the minute, and the wind, treacherous, blew sideways as if trying to push her away from the path. Away from any chance of return. Elspeth tried to guide herself by old landmarks, a grey stone, a split trunk, the oak struck by lightning 2 winters before. She found nothing. The white had erased everything, and then, for the first time, panic arrived, not as a scream, as pressure, a violent knot in her chest, the sudden sense that the world had grown too large, and she impossibly small. She turned in place, searching for a direction that did not exist. Snow had already covered her footprints behind her. It was as if the forest were correcting her presence, erasing her, so no one could later say she had ever been there. She thought of Aileen. Aileen, 15 years old, possessed a kind of fear that seemed to know the future before it arrived. She had dreamed of ravens the night before their father died. She had cried without reason the morning the officials knocked at the door. And she had been the one to grip Elspeth's hand that dawn, whispering in a voice too small for such certainty, "The forest is angry." Elspeth had never believed in omens, but there, without a path, without a horizon, with the wind pushing and the snow erasing, she began to wish she believed in anything that might save her. She thought of Moira, 19, her face always composed, always contained, as if tears were a luxury they could no longer afford. Moira stitched handkerchiefs to sell in the village and pretended the humiliation did not hurt. She carried the household accounts as if they were part of her body, and dignity as if it were a duty. If Elspeth did not return, it would be Moira who faced the next day. Moira who told their mother. Moira who held Aileen when she finally broke. And then, like a blade, the cruelest thought of all. Perhaps Moira will survive. Perhaps Aileen will survive. But Mother will not survive without her. Elspeth tried to move faster, tried to force her legs to obey, tried to breathe deeply, to turn the frozen air into something useful. But her body was already ceasing to be a body. The cold stole her in stages. First her fingers, then her feet, then her will. Pain dissolved into numbness, and numbness was dangerous because it felt gentle, almost kind. Just rest, something inside her whispered. Only a moment, just until the wind calms. I can't, Elspeth thought. I can't. But the can't moved nothing. Her legs gave way without warning, as if invisible cords had been cut. She fell first to her knees, then sideways. There was no impact, only surrender. The snow received her with an absurd softness, almost maternal, and that terrified her more than the fall, because it felt final. Through half-closed eyes, she saw things that did not belong there. Her mother in childhood, scented with lavender, laughing as she braided Elspeth's red hair. Her father, before the scandal, absent-minded, gentle, promising that the world always finds a way in the end. Moira's hands stained with thread and ink. Aileen hiding her dolls beneath the bed, as if she could save her own innocence. I don't have this right, Elspeth thought. I don't have the right to die. But her body no longer belonged to her. Snow crept over her sleeves, marked her hair. Slid between skin and fabric, the numbness rose like a tide. The sound of the cold grew louder, like a muffled bell ringing inside her skull, and the silence of the forest, which had once been absence, became presence, an ancient presence. As if the place had been waiting, Elspeth tried to call out to anyone. No sound came. Her mouth opened, but the wind carried the attempt away like dust. Her eyelids grew heavy. Darkness approached with a terrible calm, too beautiful to resist. The last thing she thought before everything slipped away was simple and desperate. Mother, and forgive me. And then the world turned white and distant. Chapter 2. The Mountain Cabin. Ewan MacIntosh, 6th Duke of Strathmore and Chief of Clan MacIntosh, did not believe in coincidence. He believed in patterns, in consequences, in debts that neither time nor death ever truly erased. That was why, when he found the woman collapsed in the snow, red-haired, young, dressed in clothes that had once been fine, but now bore the marks of dignified poverty, his first reaction was not compassion. It was irritation. Someone would be looking for her. Someone would ask questions, and he had come to the mountains for the sole purpose of escaping questions. The cabin appeared among the pines as it always did, solid, silent, nearly invisible beneath the white cover of snow. It had belonged to the MacIntosh family for generations, not as a duke's property, but as a clan chief's refuge. His grandfather had hunted deer on those slopes. His father had taught him to track and shoot among those trees. And here, far from the obligations of his title and the intrigues of Edinburgh, Ewan allowed himself to be only a man of the Highlands, not the noble society expected him to be. At 32, he had carried the title for 6 years. Ever since the morning he found his father dead in bed, the body finally surrendering to wounds that had never properly healed. Wounds caused by a gunshot during a hunt. An accident, everyone said. A terrible, regrettable accident. Ewan had never believed that. And with his final breath, his father had confirmed his doubts. He kicked the cabin door open, his arms occupied with the weight of the unconscious woman. Inside, the air was bitterly cold. He had arrived only hours earlier, and the fire had barely begun to warm the main room. Old Tavish, who cared for the cabin the rest of the year, had been dismissed for the winter as usual. Ewan preferred it that way. He preferred silence. He preferred not having witnesses to his sleepless nights, to his dark thoughts, to the hatred that still burned in his chest like an ember no snow could extinguish. He laid the woman on the worn leather sofa before the hearth and watched her for a moment. Blue lips, waxy skin. Breathing so shallow he had to lean closer just to be certain she still lived. She was young, younger than he had thought when he lifted her from the snow. 20, perhaps. Early 20s. Old enough to know better than to cross a Highland forest in the middle of a storm. Practical as ever, he began to work. He removed the soaked shawl, then the snow-filled boots. The stockings beneath were wet to the bone, and the pallor of her toes unsettled him. He knew the cold of the Highlands well enough to recognize what that color could mean. Lost fingers, lost toes. Years of hunting and harsh winters had taught him what to do. Highlander knowledge, not a duke's. For a moment, he hesitated at the damp clothing clinging to her body. There was a line of propriety that even urgency should not cross, but the alternative was to let her die on his sofa. And Ewan MacIntosh was not a man who left tasks unfinished, not even tasks he had never asked for. He fetched blankets from the bedroom, thick Highland wool, woven by clan women, and gifted to him when he inherited the title. He heated stones in the fire, wrapped them in cloth and placed them near her body. He brewed tea with the herbs he kept in the cabin for emergencies, a mixture his mother had once used before fever took her when he was only 12. He tried to coax a few sips into her, most of it spilled from the corner of her mouth, but something must have reached her, because she let out a soft sound and turned her face toward the warmth. Only then did he step back, settling into the armchair across the room, a reluctant sentry. The fire crackled between them, casting orange shadows across her face. Now that the urgency had eased, Ewan could study her more closely. Red hair, darkened by moisture, spread across the cushion like oxidized copper. The color of the Highlands, the color of his own people. An oval face with high cheekbones, pale freckles scattered across her nose. Hands small but not delicate, with calluses that suggested work no well-born lady should have known. Who was she? The daughter of some ruined gentleman, perhaps, judging by clothes that had once been fine, and hands shaped by recent labor. And why, in God's name, had she been wandering alone through the forest in the middle of a storm? The answers would have to wait. Night had fully fallen, and the wind howled against the windows like wolves circling prey. Even if he wanted to take her somewhere, and he decidedly did not want another soul under his roof, it would be impossible until the storm broke. Days, perhaps. Weeks, if winter chose to be especially cruel. He knew these mountains well. They asked no permission. They offered no mercy. Weeks with a stranger in his refuge. The thought was nearly unbearable. Ewan had built the last 6 years on carefully maintained solitude. After his father's death, he had withdrawn from nearly everyone. Childhood friends, distant cousins, political allies, who expected him to step into his father's place among the powerful. There was only Catriona, his younger sister, now married to an English viscount and living in Kent. They wrote regularly. She visited the Highlands once a year, bringing news of the south, and worried looks he pretended not to notice. It was enough. It was safe. It was all he deserved. The woman on the sofa moaned again. This time her eyes opened, only for a second, just long enough for him to catch the color, a deep green, like moss clinging to stones by the stream. Then her lids fell shut once more. But in that fleeting second, something stirred in Ewan's chest, something he recognized immediately, and crushed with the same brutal efficiency he applied to any unwanted emotion. He rose abruptly and went to the window. Snow continued to fall with merciless fury, piling against the glass in layers that would soon block all light from outside. He needed more firewood, needed to check the provisions, needed anything that would keep him busy. And away from the woman breathing on his sofa, as though she had every right to be there. She was someone else's problem. As soon as the weather allowed, he would return her to wherever she had come from and resume his life. His isolation, his anger, the wound that refused to heal. His father's ghost still haunted that cabin, those mountains, every corner of his memory. There was no space for anyone else. He needed firewood. He needed movement. He needed anything that would pull him away from the motionless body breathing on his sofa, from the presence that threatened to occupy a space he had kept empty by choice and by necessity. He put on his coat, pulled the hood over his head and stepped into the biting wind, letting the door slam behind him with more force than necessary. When he returned, carrying armfuls of firewood that he stacked with near-aggressive force, the sight by the hearth made him stop for a moment. She was shivering. Not the violent tremors from before, but something deeper, the body fighting to produce heat it could no longer create on its own. Ewan muttered a quiet curse in Gaelic, threw more wood onto the fire, and knelt beside her to adjust the blankets, his movements quick and precise, those of a man who knew all too well the cost of acting too late in the Highlands. The night would be long, and he had the uneasy sense it would be only the first of many. He sat again in the armchair, eyes fixed on the flames, and allowed himself, for the first time in months, to think of his father. The 5th Duke of Strathmore had not been merely a noble with an ancient title. He had been a man. A Highlander who knew every stone of his land, every family of his clan, every story whispered around the fires. He had taught Ewan to hunt, to fight, to lead. And on the last morning they spent together, before the fateful hunt. He had said that a Mackintosh protected his own until his final breath, and then a shot to the chest. An accident, they said. But the Mackintosh and the Drummond families had never been allies. Disputes over borderlands, a refused marriage 2 generations earlier. Hard looks exchanged at assemblies, the kind of quiet rivalry the Highlands cultivated like weeds among stone. None of it was reason enough to kill. None of it should have mattered. Until that hunt. Ewan closed his eyes and saw it again. The autumn gathering on Mackintosh land, nobles assembled for the annual hunt. An old tradition, a social obligation among titled neighbours. The Viscount of Ardmore, Alistair Drummond, had come with his rifle and his affable smile. The same smile he wore at every gathering. The same smile Ewan had learned to distrust since boyhood. And then, on the 3rd day, the shot. A deer moving at the wrong moment, they said. An accidental discharge that struck the Duke instead of the animal. Alistair Drummond kneeling in the mud, rifle still smoking in his hands, his face white as the snow now blanketing the world outside. It was an accident, he had said, his voice shaking. For God's sake, it was an accident. And everyone believed him. The other nobles, the servants, the local authorities who came to investigate. Everyone agreed it was a terrible tragedy, one of those misfortunes that occur when men and weapons meet in forests. Everyone except the Duke himself. The 5th Duke of Strathmore did not die that day. They carried him home, summoned doctors from Edinburgh, did everything money and desperation could do, but the wound was too severe, the bullet too close to the heart. For a year, Ewan watched his father fade. Each day weaker, each night racked by pain no laudanum could ease. And one night, 3 days before the end, his father summoned him. Ewan could still feel the grip of that hand, once strong enough to fell a man, now fragile as dry branches. He could still see the fevered light in eyes that had once commanded an entire clan. And he could still hear the words, each one branded into his memory like hot iron. It wasn't an accident, Ewan. The voice was little more than a rasp. I saw his eyes before the shot. He knew what he was doing. Drummond wanted me dead. Father, promise me. The hand tightened with a strength that should not have existed in such a broken body. Promise you will never forget. Promise you will never forgive. Drummond blood is poison, my son. Never trust them, never. And Ewan had promised. At 27, with tears burning in his eyes that he refused to shed, he promised to hate Drummond blood until his final day. He promised to keep the memory alive. Promised never to let that name cross his path without remembering the price his family had paid. 3 days later, his father died, and 3 years after that, Alistair Drummond, the Viscount of Ardmore, was found dead in his own study. A gunshot, and a letter whose contents were never truly known, only whispered about. Suicide, they said. Ewan called it truth. He called it truth because it was easier than admitting he would never have proof. Because a murderer's conscience, he told himself, was a burden even cowards could not carry forever. Drummond's death brought no peace. It did not erase the oath. It did not return the father Ewan had lost. It only left behind a widow and 3 daughters, now living in poverty, paying for the sins of a man who had chosen the easiest way out instead of facing the truth. Across the room, the red-haired woman murmured something in her fevered sleep. A word, a name, perhaps. Ewan could not make it out. But something in the sound, something vulnerable and lost, made his stomach tighten in a way he could not name. He looked away, fixing his gaze on the fire once more. She was only a stranger, the daughter of some ruined gentleman from the surrounding lands, lost in the storm for reasons that did not concern him. In a few days, she would return to her life. And he to his solitude. Nothing that happened in that cabin would change who he was, or what he had sworn. He repeated that to himself until the first light of dawn began to soften the horizon, painting the snow outside in shades of rose and gold. He did not believe a single word of it. Chapter 3. Fever and Silence. Elspeth woke in pieces. First came the heat so intense after so much cold, it felt as if it were burning her from the inside out. Then came sound, the crackle of a fire, the distant howl of wind, the the groan of floorboards beneath heavy footsteps, and only after all of that, much later than the rest, came the realization that she was not dead. She tried to open her eyes, but her lids felt sewn shut. She tried to move her fingers, but pain flared sharp enough to pull a groan from her throat. She tried to speak, ask where she was, who had brought her here, how much time had passed. Only a rough sound came out, barely human. "Don't try to move." The voice was deep, not gentle but steady. Elspeth felt a hand lift her head and something warm touch her lips. Tea. She drank on instinct. The liquid slid down her throat like fire, and when she finally forced her eyes open, she saw only a blur of orange light and the dark outline of a man moving away. "Where?" she managed. "My cabin, in the mountains above Glencairn." The voice came from her left, but she couldn't turn her head to find him. "You nearly froze to death in the forest." Glencairn. So she was still close to home, close enough to make it back. Her mother, Moira, Aileen. She had to return. She had to tell them she was alive, that she hadn't abandoned them, that the medicine. She had never reached the apothecary, the whole journey, for nothing. She tried to sit up, and the world spun violently. "I said don't move." Firm hands pressed her back into the cushions, and this time Elspeth managed to focus on the face above her, severe, all angles and restraint. Eyes a pale, icy blue that seemed to measure every reaction with careful precision. Dark beard trimmed close to his jaw, black hair pulled back, a thin scar cutting through his left brow. He wore a linen shirt beneath a thick wool waistcoat, and even without the tartan she vaguely remembered from the night before, everything about him still spoke one word: Highlander. "You've got a fever," he said. "You need rest." "My family," she whispered. "They need to know I'm alive. No one is going anywhere until the storm passes." He stepped away again, returning to the chair across the room as if closeness bothered him. It could take days, weeks perhaps. Weeks. The word struck Elspeth like a physical blow. Weeks away from home, away from her sick mother, away from sisters who must already be frantic with worry. Moira would have gone looking for her. Moira, who didn't know the forest as well as Elspeth did. Moira, who could be out there right now, lost in the same storm that had almost killed her. "I have to send word," Elspeth insisted, forcing herself to rise again. "With what messenger?" There was something almost cruel in the practicality of his tone. "The birds. No sane man will cross this storm. Not for a gold coin. Not for 10. He was right. She knew he was right. But helplessness was a weight she didn't know how to carry. For 3 years, she had been the one who held them together. She had bargained with creditors, found the house in Glencairn, coaxed her mother to eat on the days grief swallowed her whole. If Elspeth wasn't there, what remained? The fever pulled her under again before she could find an answer. The days that followed existed in fragments. She woke at odd intervals, always disoriented, always to the same austere figure caring for her in silence. He made her drink bitter tea that left her tongue numb. He changed the cool cloth on her forehead when the fever climbed too high. Once, in the middle of the night, she opened her eyes and found him asleep in the chair. For the first time, his face was unclenched, almost human. And she thought briefly that he might not be as hard as he seemed. Other times she woke screaming. The nightmares came with the fever, vivid, relentless. She dreamed of her father, not the man she had known, gentle and distracted, lost in his books and hunting stories, but the ghost she had found in his study on that terrible morning. She saw him falling, always falling, his face twisted by something she had never been able to name: despair, guilt, relief. She saw her mother reading the letter no one else ever saw, hands trembling, the sound that left her throat not quite a scream, something worse. She saw Moira burning ball gowns in the backyard of the estate they would soon lose, fine fabric turning to ash, while Aileen sobbed with dolls pressed to her chest. And on one of those nights, she woke with tears on her cheeks, and a rough hand holding hers. "You're safe," the deep voice said, softer now than she had heard it before. It was only a dream. Elspeth clung to that hand as if it were the only real thing left in the world. His fingers were long, calloused, surprisingly warm. She didn't know his name. She didn't know anything about him beyond the fact that he had saved her, and now cared for her as if it were his obligation. But in that moment, lost between fever and fear, he was all she had. "Father," she whispered, still tangled in the nightmare. He wasn't what they said. The Drummonds aren't—" She felt his fingers tighten around hers. Just a reflex. Almost a spasm, as if his body reacted before his mind could stop it. For a heartbeat she thought he would pull away. He didn't. He stayed there holding her hand in the dark, while she murmured things she would not remember in the morning. "Moira. Aileen. They need me. Mother is ill. I can't die here. We've already lost too much." When she woke the next morning, he was across the room again, rigid, controlled, the same distant sentry as always. But something in his gaze had changed, something she couldn't name. Her new hardness, or perhaps an older one he had let slip during the night and now tried to rebuild. Neither of them spoke of what had happened in the dark. The fever began to break on the 5th day. Elspeth could sit up without the room spinning. She could swallow a few spoonfuls of soup without her stomach turning, and the man, her host, her saviour, her unwilling jailer, kept his distance, answering her questions in single words, avoiding her eyes whenever possible. But now she understood something. He was watching her. She felt the weight of those ice-blue eyes even when she pretended not to notice. There was a tension in the way he moved around her now, something that hadn't been there at first, as if she had become more than a feverish stranger on his sofa. "You still haven't told me your name," she said one afternoon, while he fed the fire. He went still for the briefest moment. So brief, it could have meant nothing. Then he continued as if she hadn't spoken. "Ewan," he said at last without turning. "You can call me Ewan. Ewan. A strong name, a plain name, as austere as the man himself. A Highland name, old as the mountains surrounding them." "Elspeth," she offered in return. She hesitated, wondering whether she should hide the surname that had become a synonym for shame. But lying to the man who had saved her life felt wrong in a way she couldn't explain. "Elspeth Drummond." The silence that followed was not like the others. It was heavier, fuller. She saw his shoulders stiffen, saw his hands stop mid-motion, saw something pass through his profile, shock perhaps, or anger, or something far more complicated. When he finally turned to face her, his eyes were no longer ice, they were contained fire. Blue flames held behind a dam she did not yet understand. "Drummond," he repeated, and on his tongue it sounded like an accusation. "Daughter of the Viscount of Ardmore." It was not a question. "Yes." A chill slid through her, nothing to do with fever. "Did you know my father?" Another silence, long enough that she thought he wouldn't answer at all. When he finally spoke, his voice was carefully neutral, each word measured as if it cost him something. "We were never close, but I know who he was. He—" Elspeth swallowed, forcing herself onward. "He died 3 years ago. I assume you heard." Everyone heard. I heard. "What they say about him isn't true." The words escaped before she could stop them, charged with an urgency she hadn't meant to reveal. "My father wasn't a coward. He wasn't what the newspapers said, but there was more, something no one wanted to investigate. He—" "Rest, Miss Drummond." The interruption was quiet, but final. Ewan was already standing, already moving toward the door, already leaving her alone with words no one wanted to hear. "The past is a country no one returns from," he said, one hand on the latch. "Rest, you've still got a long way to go before you're well." And then he stepped out into the snow, without another word, leaving her with the fire, and the inexplicable feeling that she had just made a terrible mistake. Or perhaps, and the thought frightened her more than any nightmare, he knew something about her father that no one had ever told her. Chapter 4. The Oath. Drummond. The name echoed in Ewan's mind as he trudged through snow up to his knees, walking without a destination, away from the cabin. The wind cut his face like ice blades, but he barely registered the sting. A larger storm was raging inside him, one no amount of cold could quiet. Elspeth Drummond, the eldest daughter of the man who had killed his father. For 5 days he had cared for her without knowing. He had warmed her body, guarded her sleep, held her hand while she cried in the dark. And all that time she had been carrying the murderer's blood in her veins. Ewan stopped beside an ancient pine, its trunk twisted by centuries of Highland wind, and pressed his forehead to the rough bark. Cold seeped through his coat, his shirt, his skin, but it didn't reach where it needed to reach. It couldn't touch the place in his chest that had cracked open the moment he heard her surname. Drummond. Daughter of the Viscount of Ardmore, daughter of the man whose eyes his father had seen before the shot. Ewan shut his eyes and forced himself to breathe, once, twice, 3 times. The air burned his lungs and he welcomed it. Pain was real. Pain was familiar. Pain was something he knew how to carry. Unlike what he felt now. Because what he felt now, this tangle of rage and confusion and something else he refused to name, made no sense. She was a Drummond. He should have hated her. He should have felt satisfaction seeing her reduced to this, a girl in battered clothes wandering through snow for God knew what, nearly swallowed by the Highlands. It was justice, wasn't it? The justice his father deserved, the fate that family had brought upon itself. So why did his hands still remember the shape of her fingers? Why did his mind replay the sound of her voice calling for her father through fevered delirium? And why in God's name, had the first thing he felt when he heard Drummond not been hatred, but something that looked terrifyingly like fear of losing her? He struck the pine trunk hard enough to split the skin across his knuckles. The pain helped. A little. He stepped back and kept walking, his feet finding a path he could have followed blind even beneath snow. The frozen stream. The clearing where his father had taught him to shoot. The great stone where they used to sit and watch deer at dawn. Each landmark was a memory. Each memory was an accusation. What would his father say if he could see him now? The chief of Clan Macintosh, tending to the daughter of his killer as though she were an honored guest, warming her with blankets woven by clan women, feeding her herbs his own mother had used, holding her hand in the dark while she whispered the very name he had sworn to despise. Drummond blood is poison, my son. Never trust them. Never. The words rang in his mind with the clarity of a funeral bell. He had heard them 1,000 times over the last 6 years. He had repeated them to himself on sleepless nights, on grey mornings, in every moment when the temptation to simply forget threatened to win. They were his shield, his anchor, his one certainty in a world that seemed determined to take everything he loved. And now, a woman with green eyes and hair like fire was putting cracks in that certainty. No, he refused to allow it. Ewan stopped at the edge of the clearing and stared up at a sky heavy with snow. The wind had eased slightly, but the clouds promised more storm before nightfall. Days still, perhaps weeks. Weeks trapped in that cabin with the daughter of the man who had destroyed his family. He needed a plan. He needed distance. He needed to remember who she was and what her blood represented. She had said her father wasn't what the papers described, that there had been more, that no one had wanted to investigate. Ewan had almost laughed. Of course she believed in her father's innocence. What daughter wouldn't? What daughter wouldn't build stories if stories made the truth bearable? But truth was truth, and Ewan knew it better than anyone. He closed his eyes and let himself fall back into that day. The hunt. Golden autumn in the Highlands. Nobles gathered on Macintosh land, a tradition older than any of them. His father had been in good spirits that morning, rare in the months leading up to the event. There had been tension between him and the Viscount of Ardmore, something Ewan had noticed without understanding. Hard looks across the dinner table the night before, a low-voiced conversation that ended abruptly when Ewan drew near. Something about land, something about a promise not kept. A debt not paid, something the two men seemed determined to resolve away from witnesses. And then, on the third day, the shot. Ewan hadn't been close enough to see the moment it happened. He'd heard the crack, he'd heard shouting. He'd run through the trees with his heart lodged in his throat until he found his father on the ground, blood pooling dark beneath him in the mud. Alistair Drummond was kneeling beside him. The rifle was still in his hands, and his face was white as bone. "It was an accident," Drummond kept saying, as if words could undo what had been done. "The deer moved, the gun went off. For God's sake, I would never—" But Ewan had seen his eyes, and what he saw there was not shock, not horror. It was something he still couldn't name even years later, something far too close to relief. After that came the doctors, the inquiries, the formal statements that concluded what everyone wanted to conclude: a tragic accident. The Viscount of Ardmore was cleared. Society offered condolences and moved on. And the 5th Duke of Strathmore spent a year dying slowly in his bed, his body poisoned by a bullet no surgeon could remove. "It wasn't an accident," his father had said on his last night. "I saw his eyes before the shot. He knew what he was doing." Ewan believed him. He believed him because he needed to. Because the alternative, that his father had died for no reason, by chance, by one wrong movement, 1 second of bad luck, was too unbearable to face. Hatred was easier. Hatred gave purpose. Hatred turned a senseless loss into a battle he could fight, even if he could never win it. Now the enemy's daughter slept on his sofa, and everything Ewan had built on hatred threatened to collapse. He returned to the cabin when the cold became impossible to ignore. Snow had gathered on his shoulders, his hair, even his lashes. He looked like a ghost of the mountains. Perhaps that was what he had become over the last 6 years. A haunted man. A man who could not let the dead rest. She was awake when he entered. Sitting on the sofa, blankets wrapped around her thin frame, green eyes following him with a mixture of caution and curiosity. "Your hands," she said, trying to rise. "You're bleeding." Ewan looked down at his knuckles. Skin split. Blood dried into dark crusts. He hadn't felt it until now. Now, under her gaze, every cut seemed to throb. "It's nothing." "Let me see." "I said it's nothing." But she was already on her feet, unsteady, crossing the room with a determination he recognized at once. Drummond's was stubborn. Her father had been stubborn. Stubborn enough to lift a weapon against a duke, stubborn enough to carry his secret into the grave. And it seemed his daughters had inherited that trait, along with green eyes and hair like fire. When her fingers touched his, something cracked inside him, something he had sworn would never break. She was gentle. Her touch was light, careful, so different from the rough hands he had used to strip wet cloth from her body during fever. There was competence in the way she moved, as if she had done this many times before. A sick mother, younger sisters. A ruined family balanced on shoulders that looked too fragile to bear it. "You need to clean this," she murmured, focused. "Where do you keep cloths?" "I can—" "Where do you keep them?" He pointed sharply toward the cupboard, and he watched her move across the room on wavering legs, watched her return with water and clean fabric, watched her sit beside him as though she had every right to be there, as though he were not a man who had spent 6 years hating what ran in her blood. "Why are you doing this?" he asked before he could stop himself. She looked up, surprised. "Doing what?" "Helping me. I'm a stranger. You owe me nothing." A sad smile touched her mouth, a smile that didn't belong on a face so young, one that spoke of losses no 22-year-old woman should have carried. "You saved me," she said simply. "You cared for me when I was delirious. You held my hand when I was afraid." Ewan looked away, unable to endure gratitude he did not deserve. Anyone would have done the same. "No." Her voice sharpened, steady now, almost severe. "They wouldn't have. I know how the world works, Ewan. I know what people do when they find someone collapsed in the snow." And then, quieter, like a truth she hated to say out loud, "Especially someone with my surname." So she knew. She knew the name Drummond was poison. She knew most people would have let her die without losing a night's sleep. What she did not know, what he could never tell her, was that he had almost been one of those people. That in the first seconds after hearing her name, part of him had thought perhaps the snow should have taken her. That perhaps it would have been justice, that perhaps it was what his father would have wanted, but another part of him, a part he was fighting to silence, had already crossed a line he could not uncross. She finished cleaning his hands in silence. When she withdrew, Ewan felt the absence of her touch like a fresh wound. "Thank you," she said, standing before him, "for everything. I know I'm not an easy guest. And I know my name." She hesitated, eyes dropping. "I know my name carries a weight most people would rather avoid. But you treated me with dignity. That means more than I can say." Dignity. The word cut through him. Ewan didn't answer. He didn't trust his own voice. He only watched her return to the sofa, fold herself beneath the blankets and close her eyes with a tired exhale. She fell asleep within minutes, the deep, necessary sleep of someone recovering. And Ewan stayed awake all night, staring into the fire, thinking of the vow he had made to his father, and of the woman who was making that vow feel, for the first time in 6 years, like a weight he wasn't entirely certain he wanted to keep carrying. Chapter 5. The Illusion of Safety. The days in the cabin began to settle into a rhythm, a quiet routine, one Elspeth slowly learned to recognize as a strange kind of comfort. She would wake to the sound of Ewan feeding the fire, fresh wood cracking as it caught, the noise mingling with the distant howl of wind outside. She ate breakfast in silence at the small wooden table, while he sat in the armchair across the room, eyes fixed on the flames, as if answers might be hiding there. In the afternoons, when the winter light turned just grey enough to see, she walked slowly around the room to rebuild her strength, always aware of his gaze following every step. At night, she fell asleep to the storm, and to the steady breath of a man who was still almost a stranger. Almost. That word troubled her more than it should have, because with each passing day, Ewan Mackintosh became a little less strange. Not through revelations or confessions, he remained as guarded as he had been from the start, answering questions with single words and avoiding anything that drifted too close to the personal. But there were gestures, small ones, nearly invisible, and impossible to ignore for someone who had spent 3 years learning to read what people refused to say out loud. The way he always poured her tea first, and waited until she drank before touching his own. The care with which he tested the warmth of the room before allowing her to get up. The extra blanket that appeared over her covers on a particularly bitter morning, without either of them acknowledging where it came from. The way the best portion of meat always ended up on her plate, while he took the smaller pieces without ever drawing attention to it. Kindness disguised as practicality. Elspeth collected those moments in silence, the way a desperate person might collect rare coins, saving them for days that would be harder than this, even knowing she had no right to grow attached. By the second week, she felt strong enough to try. "I can make supper," she offered one afternoon, when he came back from gathering firewood with snow clinging to his shoulders and ice crystallized in his dark beard. "I'm not an exceptional cook. I know the basics. I learned out of necessity, not talent." He looked at her as if she had suggested something absurd. "You're still recovering." "I've been recovering for 12 days. She forced herself to sound lighter than she felt. "I need to do something besides stare at the walls or I'll go mad." Then, before she could talk herself out of it, she let a small half-smile appear. "And you," she added, "forgive me for saying so, seem to need a meal that isn't burned potatoes and dried meat." Silence. She saw something shift in his eyes, surprise perhaps, or something close to amusement. It was hard to tell with a face so carefully controlled, but the corner of his mouth moved, the smallest betrayal of a smile, as if he were fighting it. "The pantry is in the back," he said at last without turning. "There are potatoes and dried meat. Don't expect miracles from the seasoning." It wasn't enthusiastic permission, but Elspeth took it as victory. The kitchen was small and practical, outfitted with the bare essentials for surviving in the mountains. She found the promised potatoes, a few limp carrots, dried herbs that had lost most of their scent, and onions that had begun to sprout. She worked slowly, careful with her strength, and yet there was something deeply satisfying about having her hands busy again. At home, she had been the one who cooked ever since they dismissed their last servant to save money. She had been the one who turned scarcity into meals that at least looked nourishing, meals that gave her sisters and her mother the illusion of normal life. She thought of Moira as she cut the potatoes, her middle sister, always practical, always contained. Was Moira standing in that same cold kitchen in Glencairn right now, trying to do the same with even less? Guilt tightened around Elspeth's chest. Moira didn't deserve to carry that weight alone. None of them deserved what fate had demanded. And Aileen, small Aileen, with her wide eyes and prophetic fears. Was she crying at night, convinced her eldest sister had died in the forest? Was she blaming herself for not insisting more, for not gripping Elspeth's hand and refusing to let her leave? A tear slipped down Elspeth's cheek before she could stop it. She wiped it away with the back of her hand, irritated with herself. She didn't have time for tears. She didn't have the luxury. "The fire's too low." Ewan's voice came from behind her so suddenly she almost dropped the knife. He stood in the doorway, arms crossed over his broad chest, watching her with that unreadable expression she was beginning to know too well. "I know," she replied, turning toward the stove. "I was about to stoke it. I'll do it." He moved past her, too close, the heat of his body stark against the cold of the kitchen, and knelt in front of the stove. Elspeth watched his hands work the wood with precise, economical movements that spoke of years of practice. Highlander hands, she thought again, not the soft hands of a drawing-room lord. "You learned to do all this on your own," she said before she could stop herself. "Cooking, keeping the fire, running a cabin in winter, those aren't things they teach a lord." He didn't answer right away. When he did, his voice was lower than usual. "I'm not only a lord, I noticed." He looked back at her and there was something different in his eyes now, something like genuine curiosity. "You noticed? You wear tartan even when you're alone. You speak Gaelic when you think no one is listening, and your hands—" She lifted one shoulder, trying to sound casual under that penetrating gaze. "Your hands are calloused from work. Not from holding champagne glasses. My father used to say you can know a man by his hands, and yours say you belong more to the mountains than to salons." The silence that followed wasn't tense. It wasn't uncomfortable. It felt thoughtful. "Your father was an observant man," Ewan said at last, rising. "He was." Her throat tightened, but she forced herself onward. "He was many things the world never knew. Many things the world refused to see." For a moment she thought he might say something. She saw his mouth part, the beginning of words, and then the words were swallowed again, hidden away. "The stew will burn if you don't stir it," he said instead, and left the kitchen before she could reply. When she served the meal, he looked down at the plate with an expression she couldn't decipher. "You didn't have to do this." "I know." She sat across from him and picked up her spoon. "But you've been taking care of me for nearly 2 weeks. It's the least I can do." He didn't answer, but he ate every bite. And when he finished, he muttered something that could have been "thank you," if Elspeth forced herself to believe it. It was the closest thing to a real conversation they'd shared since she told him her surname. The days that followed brought more moments like that. Small openings in the wall he'd built around himself. Ewan began to answer in full sentences. He allowed her to reorganize the pantry into something more efficient. And one night, when she mentioned she missed books, he disappeared into the bedroom and returned with a battered volume of Scottish poetry that had belonged to his grandfather. "It's not great literature," he said, almost defensively, holding it out as if expecting her to refuse. "But it's what I have." Elspeth took it as though it were treasure. The pages were yellowed, the spine worn from use, but the words inside were windows into a world she had almost forgotten existed. "It's perfect," she whispered. She began reading in the evenings, more to fill the silence than for any other reason. Robert Burns, Walter Scott, old Gaelic verses she could barely pronounce, yet still sounded like music in her mouth. Poems about love and loss, and the brutal beauty of the Highlands. Ewan sat in his chair, eyes on the fire, and Elspeth found herself liking the thought that something in those words, especially when she read them aloud, might reach him somewhere she couldn't see. It was on one of those nights that she saw him smile for the first time, not a full smile, only the faintest movement at the corner of his mouth, drawn out by an especially sharp line from Burns about the illusions of love. But it transformed his face in a way that stole Elspeth's breath. The hard lines eased, the tension softened, the ice in his eyes thinned. For a fleeting moment, she glimpsed the man he might have been, if he weren't carrying so much weight. The man he might have been before whatever tragedy had shaped him into stone and silence. Then the moment passed, and his expression shut again like a locked door, as if he had remembered something he couldn't allow. But she had seen it, and she couldn't forget it. "Do you have family?" she asked one afternoon while peeling potatoes in the kitchen. The question slipped out before she could stop it, and regret followed immediately. He had been more open, yes, but that didn't mean he welcomed questions. To her surprise, he answered, "A sister, Katrina. She lives in England with her husband." "Are you close?" "We write. She comes to the Highlands once a year." It wasn't an answer, not really. But Elspeth recognized the pattern. It was the same careful distance she used when strangers asked about her father, the same controlled tone designed to prevent further questions. "I have 2 sisters," she offered, deciding vulnerability should be returned if she wanted him to trust her. "Moira is 19, she's the practical one. She keeps the household running with one hand and embroiders handkerchiefs to sell with the other." A small smile tugged at her mouth, homesickness tightening her chest. "Aileen is 15, and she still believes in happy endings. I think that makes her the bravest of us." Ewan didn't speak for a long moment. When he finally did, his voice was softer than usual. "Winter won't last forever." "I know." Elspeth forced a smile she didn't feel. "But sometimes it feels like it will." "It does," he said. And there was something in his tone that suggested he wasn't talking about the weather. That night she didn't read poetry. She sat by the fire in silence, thinking of her mother, likely worse in her absence, and of sisters who must be sick with worry. Guilt stayed lodged in her chest, eased only by the hard knowledge that there was nothing she could do but wait. The storm continued. The snow continued. And she remained trapped in that cabin with a man who was at once stranger and familiar, distant and present, cold and inexplicably kind. Ewan came close without her noticing. When he spoke, his voice came from above and behind her. "They know you're strong," he said. "Your sisters." Elspeth looked up, startled. It was the gentlest thing he'd said to her since learning her name. "How can you be so sure?" He didn't answer right away. His eyes, those pale glacial eyes, looked as though they were fighting a silent battle. When he finally spoke, it was almost a whisper. "Because I would be," he said, "if I were their brother." Then he stepped back, returning to his chair, as if those words had cost him something precious. Elspeth stared into the fire for a long time, her heart beating faster for reasons she refused to name. There was something she recognized with the same certainty she recognized her own face in a mirror. And she knew she couldn't speak it aloud. And for the first time since waking on that sofa, she felt afraid. Not of winter, not of illness, not even of the ruin waiting for her family. She was afraid of discovering she didn't want to leave, and of everything that would be waiting when she finally had to. Chapter 6. Voices from the World. The messenger came on the morning of the 20th day, when Ewan had begun to believe the outside world had simply ceased to exist. The sound of hooves on snow tore him from a restless half-sleep. He was on his feet with a pistol in his hand before his mind fully caught up with what his body already knew. "Stay here," he ordered. Elspeth jolted upright on the sofa, eyes wide, her face gone pale in an instant. "Don't make a sound." She nodded and something sharp and unwanted flickered in him. Concern. No, not concern. Caution, he told himself. Only caution. The man who dismounted outside the cabin was Fergus, one of the oldest servants from Strathmore, the main estate. Short, broad-shouldered, his weathered face carved by Highland wind until it looked like stone that had learned to breathe. Ewan lowered the pistol, but his shoulders did not loosen. "Your Grace." Fergus bowed briefly, his eyes taking in his master's state in a single quick sweep. "I've brought correspondence and news." "Inside," Ewan said. "Not out here. through the back. He led the man into the kitchen and shut the door behind them. The room was cold, no fire burning the way it used to before Elspeth had quietly taken over the meals, but it served its purpose. He needed walls. He needed those words not to travel through the cabin. Ewan watched Fergus for a moment. The wet beard, the boots still streaked with frozen mud, the visible effort of catching his breath. "You're mad," Ewan said under his breath. "Few men would climb this mountain in weather like this." "I wouldn't, Your Grace," Fergus replied, "if it weren't necessary." He removed his hat, then carefully drew a bundle of letters from inside his coat, wrapped in thick cloth to protect them from damp and snow. "The steward has sent the land reports." He held them out. "Your sister wrote twice. She's been worried about your silence." Ewan took the papers without opening them. He set them on the table as if touching them was enough for now. "And down below?" he asked. Too casual for a man who cared. "How are things in Strathmore, Sow, and in Glencairn?" Fergus hesitated. Only a second. But it was enough. "Normal, at first glance, Your Grace." "At first glance," Ewan repeated, lifting his eyes. Fergus cleared his throat, uncomfortable. "The whole village has been talking about a young woman who's missing, from near Glencairn." He looked away, plainly reluctant. "They say she went out during the storm and never came back. The family is beside itself. Searches were organized when the weather allowed, but the snow doesn't allow proper searches," Ewan finished. "No, Your Grace." Fergus swallowed, then continued, as if the rest tasted bitter. "Some say she must be dead. Others," another pause, "others speculate. Your Grace knows how tongues are in small villages." Ewan did know. A woman missing, weeks passing, no body found. The collective imagination was as ruthless as winter. And if Elspeth returned now, when she returned, she would find her reputation already reduced to ash before she even crossed her own threshold. "And her family?" Ewan heard himself ask. "You know anything about them?" Fergus looked surprised by the question. "I heard in the tavern her mother is ill, Your Grace. Very ill, they say. An older neighbour has been helping, and one of the sisters sold an old ring to pay for a doctor." He hesitated again. "They say the eldest sister was the one keeping the household running." Ewan closed his eyes for a moment. So her mother was still alive. Good. And her sisters were holding on as best they could. And here he was, keeping the eldest daughter trapped on a sofa while everything down there broke apart. "She isn't trapped," he corrected himself immediately. "The storm keeps her here, not me." There was nothing he could have done differently. Nothing he could do now but wait until the weather allowed a safe descent. But the justification sounded hollow, even to his own ears. "Is there more?" he asked, his voice rougher than he meant. Fergus twisted his hands, nervous, a gesture Ewan had never seen from him before. "Some in the village have started saying the missing sister may not be dead. That she may have been taken." "Taken?" "Yes. By someone. A man, perhaps." Fergus swallowed hard. "People invent stories when they don't have answers, Your Grace. You know how it is." Ewan did know. He knew that right now, in some tavern in Glencairn, men and women were stitching together narratives about the missing Drummond girl. Seduction, abduction, fates worse than death. And when she returned, if she returned with him at her side, those stories would harden into certainty. An unmarried woman, weeks alone with an unmarried man, under the same roof. The truth wouldn't matter. Truth never competed with scandal. "Rest in the stable," Ewan said at last. "There's dry hay and blankets. Leave at dawn, before the snow closes the paths again." "Yes, Your Grace." Fergus hesitated in the doorway. "And the letters. Shall I take a reply?" Ewan looked down at the bundle on the table. Katrina's letters, full of worry he didn't deserve. The steward's reports, the dull problems of land and tenants and money, things that belonged to a different life. None of it mattered in this moment. "No," Ewan said. "Go." Fergus bowed and left through the back door, and Ewan stood alone in the cold kitchen for a long time, the letters sitting like stones on the table. Elspeth's reputation was ruined, or it would be the moment she returned. Weeks in a cabin with a man she barely knew, no matter that she'd been half dead with fever, no matter that he'd rescued her, none of that would silence tongues. She would go back to a family in fragments, and to a world eager to label her as ruined. Because of him. No, he corrected himself again, harder this time, because of the storm, because of chance, because of cruel fate, fate that seemed determined to destroy the Drummonds in every way possible. But his father's voice rose in his mind, and for the first time it did not bring satisfaction. It brought something dangerously close to shame. He tucked the steward's papers away without reading them. He knew his lands were well run, and he had no patience for reports now. He slid Katrina's letters into his pocket to answer later, if there was a later. Then he returned to the main room with the weight of a world on his shoulders. Elspeth stood by the window, arms crossed over her chest, her silhouette cut against the pale light of snow. She didn't turn when he entered, but her voice reached him before he could decide what to say. "I heard voices," she said. "Not an accusation, just a fact. A man. Was he from your estate?" Ewan considered lying. Considered telling her it was nothing important. Routine correspondence, ordinary matters, anything to keep her calm. But she deserved more than that. She deserved the truth, or at least the portion of it he could give. "Yes," he said, "a servant. He brought news." She turned then, and Ewan saw her face was wet with tears. Not grief exactly. Something more complex. Fear, perhaps. Hope. Both tangled together until they were inseparable. "My family," she said, her voice so controlled it nearly broke under the effort. "Did he say anything about my family?" Ewan nodded slowly. "He heard your mother still lives. An older neighbor has been helping, and your sisters are managing as best they can." Relief crossed her face so sharply it was almost painful to watch. Her tears came more freely now, but she didn't bother to wipe them away. "Did he say they're well?" "He said they're worried. Searches were organized, but the storm didn't allow much." Ewan hesitated, choosing his words with care, care that felt suddenly useless. "People have been talking. They think I'm dead." It wasn't a question. "Some do," Ewan admitted. "Yes." "And the others?" Her voice tightened. "What do they say?" He didn't answer. He didn't have to. He saw it. The exact moment understanding landed in her eyes. The exact moment she remembered what weeks of absence meant for an unmarried woman in a world built to punish women. "Oh," the sound was small, defeated. "Of course they speculate." "Elspeth." It was the first time he had said her name. The sound startled her, almost as much as it startled him. "Rumors don't have to mean anything," Ewan said, already hating the lie in his own words. "When you return, when you explain what happened—" "Explain what?" She gave a short, bitter laugh, with no humor in it. "That I spent weeks alone in a cabin with a man I hardly know? That he cared for me while I raved with fever? That we slept under the same roof, night after night, without a chaperone?" She shook her head. "You know how the world works, Ewan. You know the truth doesn't matter. Only what people choose to believe." He did know. God, he knew. He had spent 6 years believing something he could never prove, feeding hatred with words from a dying man. Truth was pliable. Truth was whatever people needed it to be. "There is—" The words left him before he could stop them. "A solution." Elspeth lifted her eyes, confused. "A solution?" Ewan swallowed. What he was about to say would change everything. It would destroy the careful distance he had kept. It would violate the vow he had made. It would pull him into a future he had refused to imagine. But looking at her now, this woman who had walked into death to save her mother, who had treated him with quiet gentleness without obligation, who read poetry aloud into his silence, he found he didn't care. "Marriage," he said. The word hung between them like smoke. "What?" "If you return as my wife, there will be no scandal." He spoke quickly now, as if speed could make it reasonable, could convince her, could convince himself before sanity caught up. "Your reputation would be protected. Your family would have resources. No one would question a long honeymoon in the mountains." Elspeth stared at him as if he had lost his mind. "Are you Proposing to me? I'm proposing a solution. You've known me 3 weeks. I know enough. You don't even like me. The accusation hit like a blow, because it was true. Or it should have been true. She was a Drummond. He had sworn to hate her. He had built his life on that hatred, and yet— "I didn't say that," he murmured. And the weight of the words surprised him. Elspeth opened her mouth, but no sound came. They stood there, separated by a few feet that felt like miles, while the fire crackled and the wind clawed at the cabin outside. "I need to think," she said at last, voice rough. I need to think." "There's no hurry." The words came out softer than he expected. "The snow still keeps us here, but when we go down the mountain—" He didn't finish. He didn't need to. Elspeth nodded once, then turned and walked back to the sofa. She lay down with her back to him, pulling the blankets up to her shoulders, as if wool could shield her from what she'd just heard. Ewan stood where he was for a long time, watching the curve of her back, the red hair spread across the pillow, the rigid stillness of a body pretending to sleep. He had just offered marriage to the daughter of the man who killed his father, and the most disturbing part, the part that would keep him awake all night, was that he didn't regret it. Chapter 7. The Thaw. The first sign came as running water. Elspeth woke on the 30th day of her stay in the cabin and knew before she even opened her eyes that something had shifted. The absolute silence that had ruled the previous weeks had been replaced by a steady murmur. Snow melting along the eaves, dripping in an irregular rhythm onto earth that was beginning to wake. Winter was giving way. She sat up slowly, her body still protesting sudden movement, and crossed to the window. Outside was no longer a single blur of white. Patches of brown and dark green were breaking through the retreating snow, and the sky, for the first time in weeks, showed slivers of blue between heavy clouds. She should have felt relief. Soon she could go home. Back to her mother, back to her sisters, who had likely already mourned her. Soon she would leave this cabin and the enigmatic man who had pulled her from the snow. Soon everything would return to what passed for normal in a Drummond life. Daily survival, neighbours' contempt, the weight of a surname that had become another word for shame. So why was there a knot in her throat she couldn't undo? Ewan's proposal still hovered between them, untouched since that night. Marriage. The word felt absurd and inevitable at once. He hadn't spoken of love, only of solutions, protection, silence, rumors. And she didn't know what to do with a man who offered his name to a woman he barely knew, for reasons she could not fully understand. "The winds eased a few days ago," Ewan said from behind her, "and now the thaw has begun." Elspeth didn't turn. She didn't trust her own face. "I noticed. In 2 or 3 days the roads will be passable. We can leave then. We." He had said we, not you can. The word stayed inside her long after he walked away to prepare breakfast, echoing like a bell she couldn't stop hearing. The next days felt strange, suspended, as if they were living in a narrow strip of time neither of them knew how to cross. The routine they had built, quiet meals, reading by firelight, brief flashes of connection, now seemed too delicate to survive the sunlight beginning to reach through the windows. Every hour that passed was an hour closer to the end. And Elspeth found herself memorizing details she should not have wanted to keep. The way Ewan's brow furrowed when he read the letters Fergus had brought. The sound of his steps on the wooden floor, heavy but never clumsy. The scent of peat smoke and pine that seemed to cling to his skin even when he stood far from the hearth. The impossible blue of his eyes when the fire struck them at just the right angle, ice and flame at the same time. It wasn't love. It couldn't be love. She had known him barely more than a month, and he was still a mystery wrapped in silence and shadow. But it was something that ached in a way she couldn't ignore, something that made her want to stay even while she knew she shouldn't. On the last night before their planned departure, Elspeth couldn't sleep. She rose from the sofa that had served as her bed through her convalescence and sat in front of the hearth, where the flames had reduced to dull, weary embers. The cabin was steeped in shadow, and she thought Ewan was asleep in the bedroom until she heard his voice. Can't sleep either. He was in his usual chair, so still she hadn't noticed him. His eyes glinted in the dark, reflecting what remained of the fire like a predator watching its prey. But there was no threat in that gaze, only a tired vigilance she had started to recognize as something essential in him, like breathing. "I'm thinking about tomorrow," she admitted, pulling her shawl tighter around her shoulders. "About what I'll find when I go back. Your family will be relieved to see you alive." "Yes." Elspeth looked down at her hands, laced together in her lap. "But the rumors, you said they've already begun. Weeks alone in the mountains with a man. It doesn't matter what truly happened. What people imagine is always worse." Ewan didn't answer for a long moment. When he finally spoke, his voice was lower than usual, almost a rough whisper. "I know." "Know what?" "What rumors can do." He leaned forward, elbows on his knees, his face half lit by dying embers. The shadows dug hollows into his features, making him look older, more worn. "My family was destroyed by them once," he said. "By words, by assumptions, by truths no one cared to verify." It was the most personal thing he'd ever offered without her having to fight for it. Elspeth felt her heart quicken. They were crossing some invisible boundary they had avoided for weeks. "What happened?" The silence stretched so long she thought he might not answer at all. And when he did, each word sounded as though it were being pulled from someplace deep and guarded. "My father died from a wound after a supposed accident." He swallowed. "The wound took him slowly. And the words I heard from him before he died took me the same way. Ewan, I spent years feeding a hatred I may not have had the right to feel." He lifted his eyes to hers, and there was something there she had never seen before. Not weakness, disorientation. The look of a man who had lost the ground beneath his own feet. "Years convinced I knew the truth, and now—" He exhaled, his jaw tightening. "Now I don't know what I am." He didn't finish the thought. Elspeth didn't fully understand what he meant, only that it came from a place too old to explain in one night. It didn't feel like accusation. It felt like something in him had broken long before she ever arrived in that cabin, and now, without permission, was beginning to shift. Her voice rose before she could stop it. "My father also died, because of something no one understood," she said quietly. "They accused him of things he didn't do. The shame destroyed him." Heat burned behind her eyes, but she refused to let tears fall. "Sometimes I think we died with him, that we only kept breathing out of habit, out of obligation, because there was no other choice." Ewan stood so abruptly she startled. For a moment she thought he would leave, that her words had crossed a line that could not be crossed, but he didn't go toward the bedroom. Instead, he came closer. He lowered himself near the hearth, kneeling so he was nearly level with her eyes. "You're not dead," he said, his voice rough with something she couldn't name. "You survived. You crossed a storm that should have killed you. You carried a family the world abandoned." He paused as if the next words mattered too much to say carelessly. "That has to count for something." "Does it?" Her voice came out smaller than she intended. "It has to." His eyes held hers. And there was something there that made her chest tighten, something almost vulnerable, almost human. "If it doesn't," he said softly, "then nothing we do matters. Then we're only ghosts pretending we're alive." The distance between them had shrunk without her realizing. Now she could see every detail of him, the thin scar above his brow, the tension carved around his mouth, the strange truth of his eyes up close. They weren't only blue. There were threads of grey and silver in them like storm sky trapped in glass. "Why did you save me?" she whispered. "That night, in the forest, you could have walked past. You could have pretended you didn't see me. I couldn't. Why?" He didn't answer with words. Instead, he raised his hand, slowly as though fighting himself with every inch, and touched her face. Only his fingertips, a brush against her cheek, so light it felt impossible for hands that large, hands so calloused. Hands so used to hard work and cold iron and winter wood. Elspeth closed her eyes. Her heart thundered so loudly she could hear it in her ears. Every nerve in her body knew that touch, knew how rare it was, knew how dangerous. When she opened her eyes again, he had already stepped away. He stood by the window now, his back to her, shoulders rigid, as if they carried a weight no one could see. Moonlight poured silver over the snow still covering the world outside, and his silhouette against that brightness looked carved from stone. "You should sleep," he said, his voice controlled again, distant again. "Tomorrow will be a long day." Elspeth wanted to protest, wanted to cross the space between them and demand explanations, demand he look at her again with that tilt of raw honesty that made her world shift, wanted to ask about the proposal, about what he truly felt, about why a man who carried an old hatred toward her family had chosen to rescue her, care for her, touch her with a tenderness that contradicted everything he refused to say. But something in his posture, something final, closed, stopped her. He had offered more of himself tonight than he had in all the weeks before. Perhaps it was all he could give. Perhaps it was more than he meant to. "Good night, Ewan," she said quietly. "Good night, Miss Drummond." Miss Drummond, not Elspeth. The formality hurt more than it should have after what they had just shared. She lay back down on the sofa and stared at the ceiling until the first light of dawn began to brighten the windows, painting the world in pale rose and gold. Across the room, Ewan did not move from his post by the window. Neither of them slept. When they left the next morning, the sun shone over melting snow, and the world looked fragile, like crystal waiting to shatter. Ewan had saddled 2 horses behind the cabin, one for himself, one for her. He helped her mount with a courtesy so formal, it felt like it belonged to another man, in another life, one that did not include poetry by firelight and stolen touches in the dark. Elspeth looked back at the cabin once before they rode out. Dark stone walls, a roof still burdened with snow beginning to loosen, a thin line of smoke rising from the chimney. For a month, that place had been her entire world, her refuge, her prison, her... She couldn't finish the thought. She didn't look back again. She didn't trust herself to watch it disappear into the trees without something inside her breaking. But she felt, beyond reason, beyond logic, that something essential was being left behind, something that could never be recovered, no matter how many winters returned, no matter how many storms she survived. Beside her, Ewan rode in silence, his face once again a mask of stone and determination. The Highlander, the Duke, the man who had saved her, and now carried her back to the world that would destroy her. They rode for 4 hours through trails made treacherous by thawing snow. Ewan knew every curve, every slope, every place where ice gathered beneath a deceptively soft layer of fresh white. He guided her with the same quiet competence he had shown from the beginning, careful, efficient, impossible to read. When the first houses of Glencairn rose on the horizon, Elspeth felt her stomach tighten. And when they reached the village square, the looks that met them confirmed everything she had feared. Faces turned, conversations died mid-sentence. A woman pulled her child closer, as if Elspeth was something contagious. A man spat on the ground as she passed. And everywhere, in eyes, in whispers, in cruel little smiles, judgment had already been delivered. The lost Drummond daughter had returned. And she had brought with her the proof the world had always wanted, that the Drummonds were cursed and their women were made to fall. Beside her, Ewan stiffened in the saddle. Elspeth didn't need to look at him to know he saw it. He understood it. He felt the weight of those stares like stones thrown at them. The verdict had already begun, and the truth, like always, didn't matter to anyone at all. Chapter 8. The Truth That Cuts. Ewan watched the village faces close like locked doors, and something inside him, something he had spent 6 years building with meticulous care, began to crack. He knew those looks. He had seen them turned on his own family in the months after his father's death, when whispers about the hunt still drifted through Edinburgh's salons like smoke that refused to clear. He knew exactly what they meant: judgment without trial, condemnation without court, ruin without a single word needing to be spoken aloud. And now, because of him, Elspeth would endure the same fate. "Where is your family's house?" he asked, keeping his voice low and controlled. She pointed with an almost imperceptible tilt of her head, shoulders rigid beneath her worn shawl. She said nothing. She didn't have to. The silence between them spoke more loudly than any explanation could. They rode through Glencairn's narrow streets under the weight of dozens of stairs. Ewan felt each one like needles against his skin, not for himself, but for her. Because he could leave. He could return to Strathmore, to his title, to the protection his name still brought him. She didn't have that option. She would remain here in this village that had already condemned her, carrying a shame she had not earned. The Drummond house stood at the edge of town, a modest structure of grey stone that had clearly known better years. The roof needed repair, the windows were clouded with damp, and the small garden out front was nothing but mud and melting snow. Nothing about it suggested that its occupants had once moved through Edinburgh's brightest rooms. Before either of them could dismount, the door flew open. A young woman appeared on the threshold, brown hair pinned into a hurried knot, dark eyes widened with disbelief, a flower-stained apron over a simple dress. She was shorter than Elspeth, sturdier, her face marked by sleepless nights and too many worries for her age. "Elspeth?" Her voice came out strangled, barely more than a torn whisper. "Elspeth!" The cry that followed startled birds into the air. The young woman, Moira, Ewan realized, ran toward them with a speed that denied the exhaustion in her face. Elspeth barely had time to step down before she was swallowed by an embrace that looked as if it meant to fuse them into one person again. "We thought you were dead," Moira sobbed into her sister's shoulder. "We thought, when the snow wouldn't stop, when the men came back from the searches with nothing." Aileen cried until she had no tears left. "Mother asks for you every night." "I'm here," Elspeth murmured, her voice soft and broken. "I'm here, Moira. I'm alive." Ewan dismounted in silence and took a step back. He had no place inside that reunion, no right to witness an intimacy that his hatred had almost destroyed. Another figure appeared in the doorway, smaller, more fragile, with red hair identical to Elspeth's and brown eyes swollen from recent tears. Aileen, the youngest, the one who still believed in happy endings. She didn't run. She stood trembling on the threshold, as if afraid her sister was a mirage that would vanish if she moved too quickly. It was Elspeth who freed herself from Moira and approached, slow and careful, the way one approaches a frightened animal. "Aileen, you promised you'd be back before lunch." The girl's voice was thin, sharp with hurt. "And it's been a month." "I know," Elspeth swallowed. "The storm caught me. I nearly died. But you didn't." "I didn't, because someone found me." Aileen's gaze lifted, met Ewan's for the first time. There was distrust there, the healthy distrust of a child who had learned too early that the world was not kind to people like them. Unlike her sisters, Aileen looked the way survivors look. She noticed boots, scars, posture, the shape of a man's quiet. And then, before any of them could speak again, a rough voice cracked from down the street, as if it had been stored up for years just to be released in that instant. "Miss Elspeth, we all thought you were dead." The speaker approached slowly. His eyes moved from Elspeth to Moira, and then stopped on Ewan, and stayed there. The older man didn't speak for several seconds. He only stared. Then he tilted his head slightly, as if comparing Ewan's face to another he had once known. "Forgive my boldness," he said at last, doubt heavy in his tone. "But are you a Mackintosh, sir?" The silence shut like a door. Moira's brow furrowed. "Why would you ask that?" The old man didn't look away from Ewan. "Because I knew the former Duke of Strathmore, not well, but well enough to recognize when something is too similar to be coincidence." He made a vague gesture toward Ewan's face. "The eyes, they're the Duke's eyes." Ewan felt the air thin. It wasn't accusation. It wasn't a public denunciation. It was a simple question. And precisely because it was simple, it couldn't be dodged. Ewan understood in that moment that any lie would be crueler than the truth. To lie in front of them, in front of Elspeth, would be to repeat the very kind of rot his father had taught him to hate. He turned slowly toward the man, every movement deliberate, as if each gesture were an agreement with what would follow. "I am," he said. The word fell too heavy for something so short. The old man closed his eyes for a brief second, as if confirming something he wished he couldn't confirm. Then I wasn't mistaken. Moira took one step back. "The son," she breathed. "You're the son of the man my father—" She didn't finish. She didn't need to. Elspeth didn't move, not because she didn't want to, because the world had just rearranged itself around her without asking permission. For weeks she had seen only a man, a presence, silent care. Now that same man carried a name that turned every past kindness into something too dangerous to touch. She turned to him, slowly, and what was in her eyes was not anger. It was betrayal. "My name is Ewan Mackintosh," he said, his voice low, firm, irreversible. "6th Duke of Strathmore, Chief of Clan Mackintosh." The old man made the sign of the cross, as if the name itself summoned something ancient. Elspeth didn't scream. What appeared on her face was worse, a blankness opening exactly where trust had lived. "You knew," she said, flat, without emotion. "From the beginning." "Elspeth, when did you find out who I was?" She took a step toward him. "When I was fevered. When I was calling for my father." "Yes." The word dropped between them like stone in still water. Elspeth didn't flinch, didn't shout. She simply stood there, absorbing the weight of that answer. Her silence was worse than accusation. "You cared for me," she said finally. "You held my hand while I cried for the man you believe killed your father." "I didn't." "You offered me marriage." Her voice lifted slightly. "Marriage, even knowing everything." "Why?" Ewan opened his mouth and found that the words refused to line up into something clean. How could he explain that the hatred he'd carried his entire adult life had started to feel wrong? That every day in the cabin had worn down certainties he believed unbreakable? That looking at her was like looking into a mirror that showed him what he might have been if he hadn't chosen rage? "Because I couldn't do it any other way," he said at last, quiet, without defense. "I knew that when you returned your reputation would be stained, not by something you did, but because the world always needs an ugly story to tell." He held her gaze. "When I saw you in the snow, I didn't see a Drummond." The words cost him physically. "I saw a woman dying, someone who needed to be carried, protected, saved." He looked away for one brief second, as if that were the hardest part. "And then," he swallowed. "Then in the cabin, day after day, I tried. Believe me, I tried. I tried to remember the enemy you were supposed to be." "The enemy I was supposed to be," Elspeth repeated it slowly, testing each syllable like a blade against skin. "Is that what I am to you? What I always was?" "It's what I swore you would be." His jaw tightened. "It's what my father made me promise. Your father." Her voice hardened. "The same father who spent a year poisoning you against my family. My father spent a year dying." The old anger rose despite his efforts to hold it down. "Dying from a wound your father caused. It was an accident. It's what everyone said." His voice sharpened, then steadied. "But I wasn't there. And my father told me what he saw in your father's eyes before the shot. Something no one else wanted to see." "And you believed him," she said. Not a question. "You believed the words of a man who was dying in pain, who maybe just wanted his suffering to mean something more than bad luck." The thought hit Ewan like a fist, because it was possible. Because he had never allowed the possibility to exist. "What should I have done?" he demanded, rougher than he meant. "Should I have revealed myself and told you I'd spent years hating a dead man? Should I have told you that when I learned who you were?" His tongue stuck to the worst truth of all. "A part of me thought the snow should have taken you." The silence that followed was absolute. Elspeth stepped back as if he'd struck her. Behind her, Moira made a low sound. Not shock, but confirmation. As if she had always known no Mackintosh could be trusted. "Go," Elspeth said, so softly he almost didn't hear. "I'm grateful for what you did, but I think everything ends here." "Elspeth, I didn't mean—" "You did." She lifted a hand, stopping him. "Maybe not for long, maybe only for a moment. But you did." Moira moved then, crossing the distance in 3 firm strides. She took Elspeth by the elbow, not with force but with purpose, and began guiding her toward the house. The gesture of someone shutting borders, drawing a line no one crosses. Aileen lingered for one heartbeat longer, her young eyes, far too old for her face, fixed on Ewan's tartan as if it were a serpent wrapped around his chest. Then she looked at Elspeth, and something passed between them that didn't need words. A silent, "I warned you." A silent, "The forest was hungry." Then she turned and followed her sisters inside, and the door shut with a finality that echoed down the street, through the watching villagers, through Ewan's bones. He remained still for a long moment. Sunlight filtered through the clouds, spilling pale orange over the thawing snow, as if the day itself was breathing with difficulty. The old man who had recognized him drifted away, walking slowly, head bowed, like someone carrying more than age should allow. One by one, the people of Glencairn began to disperse, careful steps, murmurs traded in low voices, stories already forming, stories that would find a way to become truth before morning. None of that mattered. What mattered was Elspeth's face when he admitted that some part of him had wanted her to die. What mattered was the trust he had shattered with a truth he should have spoken weeks before. What mattered was that, for the first time in 6 years, the hatred that had kept him standing didn't feel righteous. It felt monstrous. He mounted his horse and rode out of Glencairn without looking back. He didn't trust himself to see that door closed and not break apart. But he didn't get far. At the edge of the village, a man blocked his path, short, thick, pockmarked, his eyes openly hostile. "The Duke of Strathmore," the man said, spitting the title like poison. "You had your fun with a Drummond girl, didn't you?" Ewan tightened the reins, forcing the horse to stop. "She deserves respect," he said, low, controlled. "I saved her life. I brought her home." "Saved her?" Another man stepped forward, younger, more furious. "After weeks alone with her in the mountains, her life may be saved, but her honor—" He spat onto the melting snow. "Her honor is as dead as her father." Ewan felt his blood go cold, not with fear. He could face 5 men if he had to, and they knew it. Cold because they were right, because everything they said would be true to the world, even if the details were wrong. "You will leave her alone," he said, quiet and dangerous. "She did nothing wrong." "Nothing wrong?" The first man took another step, smiling with a cruelty that made Ewan's stomach tighten. "She spent a month under a Macintosh roof. Everyone knows what that suggests. It doesn't matter what you did or didn't do." The man's smile widened. "It matters what people believe, and people will believe the worst. They always do." Ewan looked around at the faces gathering near the road, closed, hostile, hungry for someone to blame, and he understood something with sudden, brutal clarity. Leaving would not protect Elspeth. Leaving would simply abandon her to their judgment. His absence would not erase the story. It would only ensure she stood alone beneath it. "Move," he said again, but this time his voice didn't carry the intention of departure. It carried something else, the certainty that leaving now would be cowardice. He stayed in Glencairn. Night fell, and Ewan could not close his eyes. The village slept. He did not. Each hostile face from the afternoon returned to him like a calculation, not anger keeping him awake, something worse. The certainty that he had to act before silence did more damage. Because if he let the story harden without a fight, Elspeth would be buried alive, and he would be the one who handed them the earth. Chapter 9. Glencairn Square. The square was far too crowded for an ordinary afternoon, and after becoming the favourite subject on every village corner, Elspeth would not have been there at all if she hadn't been summoned by the weight of a visit. She understood that before she even saw Ewan. There was a different murmur in the air, voices too low to be innocent, too loud to be discreet. People gathered in small clusters, breaking off conversations the moment she passed, turning their faces away a heartbeat too late to pretend nothing had happened. It was a kind of attention that didn't need words to cut. She felt Moira stiffen beside her. "Something is wrong," her sister murmured, drawing closer as if a body could shield another body from a village. Elspeth nodded but didn't answer. She already knew. He was there. Ewan stood at the center of the square near the stone fountain, too tall, too still, like a man who had decided he would not step back even once. Several village men surrounded him, not as allies, but as silent witnesses. No one smiled. No one looked comfortable. When their eyes met, the impact struck Elspeth like a physical blow. There was no rage on his face. There was something worse, a controlled, cold hardness, carefully built over something that looked ready to collapse. "Mrs. Drummond," he said, voice steady enough for everyone to hear without needing to be loud. "We need to speak." Speak. The word sounded almost ridiculous in that setting. "Here?" she asked, equally controlled, though her heart had begun to beat too fast. "In front of everyone? This is where everyone enjoys judging your life without caring for the truth," he replied. "So let it be here that the truth is heard as well." A murmur rippled through the square. Elspeth felt Moira shift beside her, ready to step in. Elspeth lifted a hand, quietly asking her sister not to. Not because she was brave, because running now would only confirm what they already wanted to believe. "Then say it," Elspeth said. "What needs to be clarified?" Ewan drew a breath, and for a brief moment it looked as though he was fighting himself. "For years," he began, "I believed your father was responsible for my father's death. I believed it was cowardice. That he fired to escape the consequences of a confrontation he himself provoked." The words landed inside her like an old blade, familiar, already buried, already rusted into the deepest part of her life. "That version traveled quickly," she said. "It still travels quickly." "Yes," he nodded slowly. "Too quickly, too neatly." Some of the men exchanged looks. The square had fallen silent now, an attentive, dangerous silence. "There are things," Ewan continued, "that do not fit that story." They never did. Elspeth felt her blood turn to ice. It wasn't a direct accusation. It was something more uncertain, more unstable. "And what, exactly, are you insinuating, Your Grace?" someone demanded from behind them. Ewan did not take his eyes off Elspeth. "I'm saying that perhaps not everything was told." His voice didn't rise, but it carried. "Not by me, not by you, not by the newspapers." The word newspapers dropped like a stone into still water. Elspeth opened her mouth to defend her father, to repeat truths she had spoken so many times they had begun to sound like echoes, when Moira stepped forward. "Enough." The word came out firm, clear, unexpectedly powerful. Every head turned toward her. "This is not a court," Moira went on, "not a trial, and certainly not a spectacle to satisfy the curiosity of those who lost nothing that day." "Moira," Elspeth tried. "No." Her sister did not turn. "Enough." Moira faced Ewan directly. "If something must be said, then say it in private. Not here, not like this, not at the cost of one more public humiliation." The silence that followed was thick as snow before it falls. Ewan held Elspeth's gaze for a long moment. Conflict moved behind his eyes, not the loud kind, but the kind that happens inside a man when old certainties begin to crumble. When he spoke again, his tone did not seek authority. It sought control. "Perhaps this isn't the ideal place," he said slowly. "But this is where the whispers were born, and this is where they must end." A murmur passed through the square. Then he turned, not only to Elspeth, but to everyone. "For years, I believed I knew the truth about my father's death. I believed it because it was simple." His voice sharpened with honesty, not anger, because hatred needs simple versions in order to survive. He paused. "Today, I know only this. We may never know the whole truth. We may never know who was wrong, or whether there was any mistake at all." Some men traded glances, others frowned, frustrated by the lack of a verdict. "What I do know," Ewan continued, voice firmer now, "is that turning suspicion into a sentence destroyed 2 families, and I will not allow it to keep destroying this one." The silence became absolute. "The Drummond family is not responsible for the stories people tell about them, not for what was written, not for what was whispered." His words fell like iron on stone, "and certainly not for the hatred I fed for far too long." He drew a breath, then looked back at Elspeth. There was no defense in him, no pleading, only naked truth. "Perhaps I could have kept hating your family," he said, voice lower. "If I hadn't found you in the snow that day, if I hadn't heard you calling for your mother while you burned with fever, if I hadn't seen the fear in your eyes when you spoke of your sisters." His jaw tightened, and he stopped himself mid-thought. "If I hadn't realized that anger was easier than truth." "And the truth is?" Elspeth asked, barely above a whisper. He looked at her without walls. "That I can no longer look at you as the enemy I chose to believe existed." The words hung in the air, bare, unadorned, without romance, without promise. "The marriage proposal," he went on, "was not redemption, not heroism. It was the only way I knew how to keep the world from destroying you, after everything else has tried to." A long silence followed, not comfortable, not solved, but honest. "I didn't want to watch your ruin as if it were inevitable," Ewan said, voice quiet but steady enough to cross the square. "I didn't want you to carry alone the weight of rumors I helped create. I didn't want you paying for hatred you never earned." He inhaled before continuing. "So in front of everyone I do what is within my power, not to erase the past, no one can, but to interrupt it." He turned fully to her. "I ask you to accept my name, my protection, and my responsibility." He hesitated. Not weakness, but respect. "I know it is not a name that brings you comfort. I know it carries shadows." His shoulders squared. "But it is the only one I can offer to stop this story from continuing to hurt the ones who did not write it." His gaze did not waver. "I do not ask for gratitude. I ask only that you choose with me not to repeat what was imposed on us." The square remained utterly silent, and in that moment it was not a duke speaking. It was a man accepting, at last, the real weight of his own choices. Elspeth held her silence for several seconds, not the silence of hesitation, the silence of choosing each word the way one chooses where to step. When she spoke, her voice did not tremble. "You speak of protecting my name," she said, eyes locked on his, "as if this village still recognizes it as something worth guarding." A few faces turned away, others stiffened. "I don't ignore what's being offered," she continued, "and I won't pretend I don't understand the weight of your gesture." Her tone sharpened, controlled, "but don't mistake it for forgiveness, or for forgetting. What happened between our families will not be resolved in a square." She lifted her chin. "Not with a request, no matter how public it is." She drew in a slow breath, feeling Moira at her side, steady as an anchor. "Still," Elspeth paused, brief, measured, "I refuse to let my name be dragged as though I, or my sisters, committed a crime." The silence was absolute now. "If I accept," she said at last, "it will be by choice, not by fear, not by gratitude, not to silence gossip." Her eyes did not leave his. "It will be to interrupt this violence disguised as morality." She stepped forward. "I will marry you." The sentence fell clean, without ornament, not as absolution, not as a promise of affection, but as a conscious agreement, made before everyone, so that no other woman is treated like a social corpse for something she did not do. A murmur crossed the square, but no one dared interrupt. "What comes after," Elspeth concluded, "belongs only to the two of us, and it will not be decided here." Then she turned, gripping Moira's hand with quiet firmness. "And now, if there is nothing else left to judge," she said, looking around the faces that had fed on her shame, "I'm going home." And she did, leaving behind a square suspended in silence, and a man who finally understood that this marriage had not been granted. It had been negotiated as equals. Chapter 10. Husband and Wife. The ceremony took place 3 days later. There were no banns read in church, no invitations sent to neighbouring families, no trace of the wedding Elspeth, daughter of a viscount, had once imagined for herself. There was only the small stone church of Glencairn, Reverend MacLeod, who had known the Drummonds long before the fall, and a handful of silent witnesses. It was early, the sky still heavy with low clouds, the cold slipping through the ancient cracks in the walls. Ewan watched Elspeth walk down the narrow aisle with an attention that bordered on pain. She wore a simple dark blue wool dress. No embroidery, no lace, no adornment that suggested celebration. There was no veil, no flowers. Her red hair was pinned into a low knot, a few loose strands escaping, as if even they refused full discipline that day. There was only her, not as a dreaming bride, not as a victor, but as someone making a decision too difficult to be decorated. She did not smile when she reached the altar. Ewan had not expected her to. What stood between them was not joy, not yet. It was a quiet agreement, a fragile truce, a choice made against the weight of the past, not in spite of it. When the Reverend began the ritual words, Ewan heard them as if from a distance, muffled by his own awareness. Husband and wife. The words felt larger than he knew how to carry. When it was his turn to speak the vows, he promised honor, fidelity, and care with a clarity that bordered on penance. He did not promise love, not yet, but he promised not to repeat the inheritance of ruin he had been given. When Elspeth spoke, her voice remained steady, though her hands trembled slightly when she placed them in his. She said yes, without illusion. And somehow, that made everything more serious. When the Reverend declared them joined, Ewan leaned in to kiss her. At the last instant, Elspeth turned her face. His lips touched only her cheek, cool, restrained, distant. It was not rejection. It was a boundary, a clear reminder that marriage did not erase wounds, did not dissolve the past, did not grant intimacy by decree. Ewan accepted the gesture in silence, the way he accepted everything from her now, with respect, without demand. The journey to Strathmore filled the rest of the day. Elspeth travelled in the carriage with Moira and Aileen, her condition accepted without argument. Their mother would remain in Glencairn until she was strong enough to travel, under care paid for by Ewan. He rode beside the carriage, preferring the cutting cold of open air to a closeness not yet permitted. Through the fogged glass he saw Elspeth seated between her sisters, gaze fixed on the passing landscape, already distant, as though part of her had gone ahead alone. When Strathmore appeared on the horizon, imposing beneath the darkening sky, Ewan felt no pride. He felt weight. The stone manor, solid, ancient, steeped in centuries of dominion, seemed less a home than a witness to everything he had inherited without choosing. The servants waited in ordered silence. The housekeeper, Mrs. Crawford, greeted Elspeth with practiced reverence, calling her "Your Grace" as naturally as breathing. Elspeth answered with equal composure. She wore the role with a precision that unsettled him. There was no visible anger, no theatrical resistance, only a courteous distance that reminded him with every gesture that this marriage was not yet a meeting. The days that followed settled into a clear rhythm. Elspeth stayed surrounded by her sisters, took her meals accompanied, retired early. The Duchess's chamber remained separated from his by a door that was always closed. Ewan did not try to open it, not from fear, but from respect. In the third week of marriage, he began reorganizing old property documents, ancient debts, poorly recorded leases, verbal agreements passed down through generations. That was when he found the journal. He did not read it at once. He recognized his father's handwriting on the worn spine and felt something tighten in his chest. He put it away, closed the drawer, stepped back. He was not ready. But that night, alone in his study, he opened the volume. There were no emotional confessions. There were records, old promissory notes, borderland maps, annotations about agreements never formalized, correspondence revealing persistent, illegal attempts to claim land that did not belong to the Macintoshes. There was no absolution there. There was proof. Proof that the dispute between their fathers had not been only tragedy, but also administrative abuse, power misused, threats carefully veiled. Ewan closed the journal with steady hands. The truth no longer shocked him. But now he could repair it. He rose and walked to the window. Moonlight washed Strathmore in the same cold glow it always had. Somewhere in the house, Elspeth slept, or pretended to, carrying a past that still pressed upon her father's name. He knew what needed to be done, but not yet, not without her. The truth did not belong to him alone. And for the first time since the oath he had sworn 6 years earlier, Ewan understood that redemption could not be imposed. It had to be granted. and it would have to come from her hands. Chapter 11. The Choice. Elspeth was not sleeping. She sat at the small writing desk in the Duchess's chamber, the candle burned low, the paper before her still blank. Since arriving at Strathmore, the room had remained too immaculate, too large, too quiet, as if it had been prepared for another woman, a version of her that no longer existed. On the desk lay a yellowed envelope. The wax seal had been broken years ago. The letter had been read only a handful of times, always in silence, always with care. Not because it hurt too much, but because it changed everything each time it was read. Elspeth traced her fingers along the edge of the paper. She had known what she needed to do since the square in Glencairn, since the moment she saw the hatred in Ewan's eyes collapse, not in rage, but in confusion. Since she realized he was not the enemy she had imagined, but another heir trying to survive the sins of his father. The knock at the door did not startle her. She had been expecting it. Elspeth. Ewan's voice came low and contained, as though he were careful not to intrude upon the space she had built between them. She stood, drew a steady breath, and opened the door. He stood there without his coat, wearing only a dark shirt, sleeves rolled up as if he had forgotten himself. His pale eyes looked more tired than in the days before, not exhausted but too alert, like a man who had reached a decision and did not know if it would be accepted. "May I come in?" he asked. She stepped aside to let him pass. Neither of them spoke as he crossed the room. The fire murmured softly in the hearth. The Highland wind pressed against the windows. There was something solemn in the silence, as if this were a moment that could not be repeated. "I found my father's documents," Ewan said at last. "Records, proof, lands he tried to claim without right. Threats disguised as agreements." He inhaled slowly. "I did not come to justify him. I came to say I can correct part of what was done." She nodded, calm. "I know." He frowned slightly. "How?" Elspeth walked to the desk and picked up the envelope. The letter only her mother had read, and later, when illness took her strength, had given to Elspeth. "Because 3 years ago, long before you found me in the snow, I already knew half the truth," she said, turning to face him. "And now you need to know the other half." She held out the letter. Ewan took it with hesitant hands, not from fear, but from respect. And he read, "My daughters, if you are reading this letter, it is because I lacked the courage to say in life what I now write. I was not as innocent as you may wish to believe, nor was I the cruel man the papers portrayed. There were disputes before that hunt, lands that should never have been questioned, pressures applied with too much politeness to be called threats, and too much force to be ignored. I knew that resistance meant losing everything. I also knew that yielding meant accepting an injustice I could never explain to you. That day on the hunt, I carried more than a weapon. I carried fear. I carried anger. I carried the certainty that I was already cornered. I do not know, and may never know, whether the shot was accident, error, or the consequence of everything that had been buried in silence. What I do know is that if I spoke, if I exposed the agreements, the records, the pressures, my daughters would be destroyed by a world that does not forgive women who inherit men's conflicts. So I stayed silent. But I know now that silence did not save us, because by saying nothing, I allowed others to tell the story for me. I do not ask for absolution. I ask only that my silence not become an inheritance of guilt. If this truth ever comes to light, let it be when you are strong enough to survive the knowledge that I may not be the man you believed me to be. With love and failings, your father." Ewan read in silence, once, then again. His expression remained controlled, but something within him shifted, as though old pieces were finally finding their place. When he finished, he closed his eyes briefly. "He knew," he murmured. "Your father knew mine was in the wrong. And still he carried the blame alone," she finished, "not to protect himself, but to protect us, so we would never be tied to the dispute." Silence settled between them again. It was no longer heavy. It was final. "You did not owe me this," Ewan said quietly. "You could have kept the letter. You could have let me live with an incomplete guilt." "I didn't do this for you," she replied evenly. I did it because I no longer want to live under lies, not your father's, not mine. She met his gaze, and because I don't want our marriage built on silence. He looked at her as though that were the hardest truth of all. Our marriage, he repeated. You still call it that. It is what it is, she said. A fact. A choice. Not an empty promise. Ewan stepped closer but stopped short of her space. I will not ask forgiveness for what my father did, he said. I have no right to ask for something you may never be able to give, but you must know this. His voice faltered for a single breath. If you decide to leave tomorrow, I will accept it. I will secure your freedom, your family's safety. Your name will be cleared with the documents I found. I will not use this marriage as a chain. The weight of it struck her harder than she expected. You would let me go. If that is the only way not to repeat what our parents did, yes. She studied him for a long moment. The man before her was not the commanding duke of the square, nor the silent rescuer of the storm. He was someone in reconstruction, imperfect, vulnerable, acutely aware of his own weight. I don't know if I love you, she said at last. Not yet. And perhaps never in the simple way books promise. I'm not asking for that, but I do know I don't want to run anymore. She stepped closer. Not from the truth, not from you, not from what might exist if we are honest enough to endure it. Ewan held his breath. It means I will stay, she said, firm, not out of duty, not out of fear, but because I choose to try. She placed her hand over his chest, feeling his heart race beneath her fingers. I know what you did in the square was not easy. I also know it is not easy to learn your father was wrong. That is why I choose to see whether the man I knew in the cabin survives the man of the title, whether what joined us in the snow can endure what awaits us here. He covered her hand with his. I will prove it, he said, not with promises, with choices. She nodded. Then begin by respecting what I still cannot give. Always. She was the one who leaned in first. The kiss held no urgency. No hunger, no triumph. It was brief, measured, a meeting of lips that demanded nothing beyond what both were willing to offer in that moment. Presence. When they parted, she rested her forehead against his. The door, she said softly. It can remain unlocked. That is all I can offer for now. It is more than I expected. Ewan smiled, not wide, not victorious, but true. Side by side, they walked to the window. The sky was beginning to pale, dawn slowly dissolving the dark blue of night. A new day rose over Strathmore. Nothing was resolved, but nothing remained hidden. And for the first time, Elspeth felt that this choice, difficult, imperfect, conscious, was truly her own. Epilogue. Winter returned to the Highlands a year later, laying its white mantle over the mountains, the same snow that had nearly claimed Elspeth's life. Now she watched it fall through the tall windows of Strathmore, a warm cup of tea cradled between her hands, the fire crackling softly behind her. This time she was not alone. You're thinking again. Ewan's voice came from behind her, followed by the quiet sound of his steps across the wooden floor. She felt his hands settle on her shoulders, his fingers easing a tension she had not even noticed she was carrying. A year of marriage had changed many things between them. The careful distance had given way to an intimacy built day by day. The awkward silences had become shared ones, and the door between their rooms was now merely a passage neither of them remembered closing anymore. I'm remembering, she said, leaning back until her head rested against his chest. Last year, the forest. You carrying me through the snow as if I weighed nothing at all. You barely did, he murmured, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. You were starving and frozen. I thought I'd lose you before we reached the cabin. But you didn't. I didn't. They stood like that for a long while, watching the snow spiral down over the gardens of Strathmore. Outside, the world lingered in that rare stillness only winter could create. Mother spent the entire morning planning the spring garden, Elspeth said with a faint smile, and then asked me for the third time today when she should expect a grandchild. Ewan let out a short, resigned laugh, amused despite himself. She seems to have recovered not just her health, but the energy to command the entire household. She has, Elspeth nodded. The doctor says the rest, the steady care, and the air here did more for her than any medicine. But I think it was the security. Knowing she no longer has to fight every day just to survive. She paused. For the first time since Father's death, she isn't waiting for the worst. She's waiting for the future, preferably with an air running through the corridors. Ewan laughed softly, resting his forehead against hers. So we're officially under pressure. Officially, Elspeth agreed, with great expectations. After a moment she added, changing the subject, I received a letter from Moira. The wedding is confirmed for the spring. Ewan smiled against her hair. Moira had met the son of a baron during a visit to Edinburgh in the autumn, a serious, kind man who treated her as though she were made of something precious. It was not a grand title, but it was a good man. And after everything Moira had carried for the family, she deserved a good man. And Aileen, he asked. Still refusing every suitor, Elspeth laughed softly. She says she won't marry until she finds someone who makes her feel what... She stopped, colouring faintly. What you feel for me, Ewan prompted gently. Those were her words, not mine. But are they true? Elspeth turned in his arms, lifting her face to meet his eyes. Eyes that once had seemed carved from ice now burned warm and alive, holding something she could finally name without fear. They are, she said. They are the truest thing I know. Ewan bent and kissed her, not the hesitant kiss of that first night in her chamber, but the kiss of a husband and wife, of lovers who had crossed fire together and found something worth keeping on the other side. When they parted, he held her face in his hands, his thumbs brushing her cheeks. I have something for you. A gift. To mark the anniversary. 1 year since I found you in the snow. You remembered the date. I remember every detail of that day, he said, his gaze darkening with memory. Every snowflake. Every second until I reached you. Every heartbeat I counted, afraid the next would be the last. Her throat tightened. What is it? She asked softly. Ewan stepped back and drew a small yellowed envelope from his coat pocket. It was sealed with red wax, stamped with the Macintosh crest. Open it. Her hands trembled as she broke the seal and read. As understanding dawned, tears spilled freely down her cheeks. It was a deed, an official transfer of ownership. The lands along the border between Strathmore and the former Drummond holdings, the very origin of the tragedy between their families, now belonged to her. Not to the duchy, not to the Macintoshes. To Elspeth Macintosh, Duchess of Strathmore, to do with as she wished. The records have already been recognised by the Edinburgh court, Ewan said gently. They can no longer be contested. She looked up, unable to speak. The debt my father tried to enforce, he continued. The promise used to justify threats and destruction. Those lands should have belonged to the Drummonds from the beginning. My grandfather took them dishonourably. My father tried to keep them the same way. He tightened his grip on her hands. I'm returning what was always yours by right. Ewan, it isn't enough, it never will be, he said quietly. But it's a beginning. He kissed her hands, one by one. A sign that we don't have to repeat their mistakes, that we can choose another path. Elspeth said nothing. She simply fell into his arms, pressing her face to his chest as the tears came without restraint. He held her tightly, murmuring soft words in Gaelic she did not fully understand, but which sounded like promises. When she pulled back, he was smiling, that rare, honest smile she had learned to love. There's one more thing, he said. More. One last thing. Ewan took her hand and led her through the corridors of Strathmore, wrapping her in his coat before guiding her out into the cold. The path carried them away from the house, toward a stand of oak trees she did not yet know well. And there, surrounded by ancient branches dusted with snow, stood a cabin. Small, built of dark stone. A thin thread of smoke rose from its chimney. I had it built in the summer, he said almost shyly, for when you want quiet, for when you need a place that's yours. He hesitated. Or ours, if you wish. Elspeth stood motionless for a moment, then began to laugh, a sound broken with tears and freedom. "You rebuilt the place where I fell in love with you. I hoped that's how you'd see it. It's exactly how I see it." She kissed him there beneath the falling snow, a kiss full of gratitude, love, and promise. "Don't die on me now," she said, echoing the first words he had spoken to her in another life. "Don't make me do that work again." Ewan laughed, warm and deep. "I don't intend to," he said, lifting her into his arms. "I have far too much to live for now." He carried her across the threshold as one crosses a final boundary. Inside, the fire burned bright, soft blankets waited, and a kettle already sang. Everything was ready. "Welcome to our refuge, my Duchess," he said, "our place away from the world." Elspeth looked around, at the stone walls, the dancing fire, the man watching her with a love she finally allowed herself to deserve, and knew she had found her place. Not in the title, not in the land, but there, in the arms of a man who had begun as her enemy and become her home. The love born in the cruel cold of that first winter had endured the truth. It had crossed pain, betrayal, inherited ghosts, and it had survived because they chose it. Not by fate, not by chance, but by will. "I love you," she said, surprised by the simplicity of it. Ewan smiled, radiant, and kissed her again. "That much is clear," he murmured. "But I'll never tire of hearing it." Outside, winter continued its silent reign over the Highlands, but inside the cabin there was only warmth, only peace, only